I spoke to you in the last episode about our origins and how our stories are shaped by the very first things that happened to us and things even before we were born. From birth on, there are some features of our personalities that are baked in. Some of those things come from the circumstances surrounding our birth, our early childhood, such as where did we live? Where were we adopted? Were we raised by our birth parents or by a grandparent or some other relative? What was life like in the family or families that we first knew? What were we like apart from the contingencies of the political, economic, social, and religious cultural context that we were born into? All those things are examples of stories of different sizes, you might say. Some are small, made from memories going back as far as age 2 or 3. Some are bigger, such as the stories of our families and clans. Some are larger, like the story of the country we were born into, or the story of our people and what happened to them through the centuries. Some of our stories are quite a bit larger, such as those of the faith tradition that we might identify with. Your story is quite different if you were Jewish from what it would be for someone who is Native American or Hindu or Pacific Islander. When we begin to look at macro stories and meta narratives, the big narratives, we find that the larger the story, the more likely it is that we share it with an ever greater number of people. Finally, we come to see the overarching and all encompassing story in which we all are involved: the history of the planet. The biggest and most basic narrative is the story of evolution, how we have evolved and how we are evolving. When we start looking at our lives as a bunch of stories that are much like nesting dolls, stories within stories within stories within stories, ad infinitum, we begin to see that stories are not just a procession of facts, but always involve the interpretation of facts and events. I sometimes am amused when I hear people say history will record. Well, no, history does not record. People record stories that become known as history. And those histories are never without a point of view. That doesn't mean that every story is equally true, nor is it a story that could be a complete record of everything. The making of stories is somewhat like measuring the coastline of a continent. Theoretically, you can go out and measure the coastline of a continent and come up with a precise figure of its length. But by the time you do, it has been constantly changing, if only imperceptibly. By the time you've taken the measurement of even a few yards, tides and winds have changed what you're measuring, even if your means is the latest, most sophisticated instrument. Stories are like that. You can think you have a precise record of events, but there's no final addition to any story, although over time a consensus may gel that becomes the accepted version of the story. And then the accepted version becomes the orthodox version. And when that happens, woe betide anyone who is a revisionist. People who have put their trust in the orthodox version of any story, well, for example, the colonization of America. They don't take kindly to revisions of that story. As you know, that's what the present big dog fight's about, right? Fights around book bans have to do with the rattling of cages of people whose identities are all tied up in orthodox versions of history. And they take them as true, they take them as factual, and they often fiercely resist reinterpretations. But others, usually the underdogs who don't get much of a say in how stories are told and official histories are written, have a different take of not only what the story is, but how it's told. As obvious as all this is, you might well be asking, well, what has this got to do with me? Well, that's the point of this podcast. Stick with me, and I hope you'll see. In 2007, a good friend invited me to attend a conference called the Story Field Conference. The purpose of the Story Field Conference was through using open space to allow any participant to offer a workshop or attend another's workshop of some facet of story. I learned a great deal that week. I began to understand that the story field is the broad context in which stories of all sorts arise. And field is a pretty good metaphor because when I was a kid growing up on a farm, I learned to realize that a field is full of all kinds of things besides the intended crop, the one you've planted. There are weeds and plant diseases and pests, dangerous animals like snakes, contaminants, and the ever encroaching forest. Left to itself, the field will return to desert or forest or marsh or whatever its original or default environment was or is. Crops require cultivation, and so do good and true stories. During that week at the Storyfield Conference, I learned how complex and yet how basic are all histories, typical in any community. I began to see how we have evolved to tell stories as means of passing on survival information to succeeding generations. We don't tell stories only in words. The arts are an essential way of storytelling. Paintings, sculpture, songs, operas, plays and movies, games are ways of creating and telling stories that take their place alongside sagas and folk tales, poetry, prose. Entertainment, sports, and pastimes, all of them have a place in the evolutionary tale spun by humanity as a means of survival. Not long after that conference, my husband Joe gave me for my birthday a book which is one of the best I've ever read. I have touted it widely. It's by Brian Boyd, and its title is The Origin of Stories, Evolution, Cognition, and Fiction. That book took me to a new level of understanding how and why we all make up stories, tell stories, preserve stories, love stories, and sometimes detest stories. Years before that, I had read and listened to Joseph Campbell, the noted mythologist, whose insights had broadened the way I viewed stories, especially some of the archetypal themes of stories. And even before that, I had a time of a couple of years in which I attended some workshops by the well-known author Madeleine L'Engle, who said in one of those workshops, there's only a handful of stories that humans tell, and we keep recycling them. Campbell is remembered for one of those themes, the hero's journey, the subject of his book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. I became deeply interested in the work of Carl Jung, who, along with Freud, became one of the key early leaders of depth psychology. Jung and those who learned from him opened for me the world of symbols and led me and countless others to appreciate the power of the unconscious, expressed in symbol, theme, recurring storyline, such as the plethora of stories about a primeval flood that covered the earth, known to most Westerners as Noah's flood. Nearly 3 years of Jungian psychoanalysis and a lot of reading acquainted me with archetypes. Archetypes, patterns, and universal symbols that connect people from all parts of the world across time and cultures. Every letter, every card, every tweet, email, every text, every scrap of communication you create exemplifies the quintessential human activity, which is communicating, telling stories. All these things, just as much as Tolstoy's War and Peace, Dante's Divine Comedy, Romeo and Juliet, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, every one of them is a story or a fragment of a story. So, how can we trust that a story is true? How can we stop the spreading of a story that's false? Oh, those are some critical, urgent, and difficult questions. Sometimes the effects of a story are so devastating that the story is discredited, such as when in World War II, fascism, or at least fascist governments, was defeated. But anybody alive today realizes that fascism might have been defeated, but fascism itself, the story, was something else. It was like the mythological Hydra. It proves impossible to kill, and so rises and asserts its sway all over again, as in fact it's doing now. There's a great deal of confusion around the notion of myth. Sometimes we use that word as the antonym, the opposite of fact. But a true myth, such as the myths of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, is a story told conveying a universal and maybe even an eternal truth. If you pay attention to myths, they often embody truths about human nature, the natural world, the collective wisdom that over the ages has guided us in ways to live and deal with perennial complexities that keep popping up in every one of our lives. Some of the richest and most powerful stories are the big stories embedded in faith traditions, and they're also some of the most problematic. Why do I say that? Because by its very nature, religion often attracts adherents who become deeply committed to their faith tradition as the ultimate and right way to live. They're so committed and so dedicated that they become intolerant of other systems that see things differently, and the people in those systems. In every age, there have been agnostics and atheists whose existence religious people have feared, marginalized, and frequently have persecuted those people with such beliefs. Yet those very religions sometimes have profound myths that, understood properly, rebuke those who would use them as weapons against non-believers and devotees of other traditions. Today, so-called conservative and orthodox faithful tend to take not only seriously, but literally the myths of their traditions, apparently not realizing that the purpose of myths is to give meaning, not to record or describe historical events. That's not to say that none of them include historical events or are about historical events, but that's not their purpose. Facts are verifiable, they are agreed upon, even though the interpretation of those facts varies widely. One of the very real problems now is a serious proliferation of lies, propaganda, half-truths, conspiracy theories, misinformation, and disinformation. It's exceedingly hard to build and maintain community among people who can't even agree on what's fact. We have no choice about some of our stories. We don't get to choose what stories are being told in the culture in which we're born. But at least in democratic societies, we get to choose what stories we believe and those we put our trust in. Choose a story, or a story will choose you. Now and again, I read an account of somebody who has no particular political affiliation, maybe no strong religious belief. You know, they're just kind of rocking along, but they go browsing through the internet and they come across conspiracy theories, hate groups, and before long, they're radicalized. That happens frequently, it appears, to young people who don't really have much grounding, if any at all, in any tradition, and perhaps lack a viable network of positive support. And that's a red flag, because it's a big issue, far too much for me to get into in this podcast, but in a general way, the phenomenon of somebody not having a story, but being sucked up into a movement with a story that supplies that person with purpose, identity, promise, hope, meaning, and a sense of community, attest to the truth that if you don't have a story, the story is going to come looking for you and probably will choose you. That's what can happen when the deep human need for community, for meaningful connections, for a sense of personal identity is unmet or thwarted. We need to belong. We're social. We're communal. We hunger and thirst for stories that connect us with something larger. Connecting us to something larger is exactly what spirituality does. The larger something can be a community, a web of relationships, a group of friends, an organization, an institution, nature, art, music, the universe, regular participation in something meaningful like one of the martial arts or a sport or a game. Anything that binds us to a larger group or a larger entity. And sometimes the awe associated with God can be that. So spirituality does not necessarily have to be religious. It can be very secular. And some things assumed to be secular or even profane can serve as springboards for us to experience something larger with that capital L, uniting us with things that inspire, challenge, delight, and maybe sometimes scare us. Some of us would say flatly, I'm not spiritual. Well, my guess and my experience both suggest the person who says that associates spiritual with stuff they don't do, or perhaps actively disdain. Well, like religion, for example. No matter. In my book, if you're human and alive, you've got a spirit, which is that capacity for getting excited, experiencing wonder, being shaken up, feeling deeply moved or profoundly touched, reaching out to help or serve others for no apparent benefit to yourself. It's quite possible, of course, to live your whole life just ambling along from day to day, year to year, not really thinking about stories that are so much a part of you that they're like background music playing at a low volume, so low that you're not even aware of it. There are costs, however, to living that way. First, we have little or no control over some of the stories we take for granted. We'll look at the United States of America at the present time. My story about this country, which has been a part of me at least since I was 6 years old in the first grade, is that this is the land of liberty and justice for all. Now I find that the republic that I've been pledging allegiance to all these years is more like the arch enemy of my youth, the Soviet Union of Stalin's time. Due process of law that guarantees justice for all is being actively ignored. People in this country who are legally here are now going around together in packs for fear of being suddenly kidnapped and denied any right to so much as a hearing before a magistrate. Suddenly, the story that I've told myself for decades is no longer the story that's so true. And to say that causes a shock to my system is to put it far too mild. Well, take another example, the story about the church with a capital C that devout Roman Catholics once believed fervently, and some still do, has been shredded over the last quarter of a century with a cascade of revelations of illegal and inappropriate sex acts by the trusted leadership. And I'm not just giving a black eye to the Roman Catholic Church, because similar stories have upended comparable institutions and traditions. And it hurts. And a common response to all that is to dig in our heels and resist accepting that the old story, with all of its meaning and power and everything that we believed in, has been false or a half-truth, or at least not true to reality. So, we can revise the story, or appeal to a bigger story that either explains the inconsistency or supplants it or implies rewriting the story. And that kind of thing happens all the time, as when, for example, racial segregation in public schools was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1954. Over the ensuing decades, entire chunks of American racial history were reevaluated. Not everyone was thrilled by that. I'm telling you about vignettes of the pain that's sometimes occasioned by becoming conscious of stories. There's a predictable reluctance on the part of human beings to become a conscious species. Consciousness always occasions making room for new information and new understandings. Not everybody likes that. Lots of people afraid of it. We see when our personal stories begin to run aground what that's like. I had a very well constructed story, and I believe a true story about myself for decades. I could have told you when I was 5, if I'd had the vocabulary to do it, that I was gay. When I was in my teens, I didn't know what to do with what I knew to be true about me. So I chose to create another story about who I was. It wasn't a piece of fiction that just I made from whole cloth, but one that was true, at least it maybe only partially so. And I was clear about that and honest about it. But I didn't know what to do. And so I lived publicly without admitting it. And then in midlife, pressures began to mount. An inner cacophony of voices got louder and louder. And those voices weren't so much about sex and gender as they were about authenticity and a deep desire for just friendship with other men. It would take me volumes and endless podcasts to tell you what misery the crisis in my own story occasioned. I literally didn't know what to do. I was in the lyrics of Olivia Newton-John's song, tied up in promises I couldn't keep. The perfectionist in me had a very hard time adjusting to the reality of the crisis, penalizing me for letting somebody, no, not somebody, everybody in my life down, disappointing the whole lot of them. Mine is only one example of what can happen when we become conscious of our stories. Now, I could also tell you about how, as time went on, becoming conscious of my story led me into amazing experiences that have been, in fact, consistent with who I was from the start and have always been. Fully 2 decades after that crisis began, I found a new way to serve others from the ground of new consciousness. And so for a decade, I've served men who were in the same kind of situation I was in, more or less. And the story continues with deeper and deeper levels of consciousness that this all brings to me and takes me to new places. It's consistent with the person that I've always been. I suspect you know something of what I mean if you've ever been through experiences like divorce or career changes you'd never imagined possible years before. Well, welcome to the great experience of being human and to the splendid experience of becoming conscious. You know, I keep returning to what I said earlier about stories having the function of helping us survive. Us as individuals and us as a species. When lies and deception are passed around instead of truth, we all suffer. Individuals, organizations, nations, cultures, and the planet itself. We're all imperiled. No story is capable of telling all the truth at once about everything. And so we'll always have multiple stories, often in competition with each other, often contradicting each other, many times full of inaccuracies and distortions, prejudices, and all that. That's just the human thing. It seems to me in all this that the messiest and quite often the most dangerous stories are those that purport to be objective truth. Well, I said it and I believe it, and that's it. It's obvious. The ones that I find myself prizing the highest Are those stories that convey in myth and symbol, in form and imagination, the wisdom that I need to live by. And for me, by and large, the great stories of wisdom traditions exemplify that kind of story. Not just the ancient texts from the Bible, but those from the Tao Te Ching, from the Indian Vedas, from Celtic, African, Native American traditions, and folklore collected and preserved in many parts of the world are part of the story field that almost always holds true for me. Poets, some of the best in history, are truth tellers. Plays often say what prose doesn't. Movies sometimes offer views of reality that viewers would otherwise ignore. I happen to think that some of our comedians are some of today's finest prophets. Not all of them, maybe, but many. But I'm quick to say that what speaks to me and what I think about all this is not necessarily what will speak to you. The challenge for us, all of us, is to become more and more clear about the stories that we're living by, the stories that we're making, the stories that guide our lives, that shape us, and that make the world livable, not for us only, but for us all. And if any of that propels us into the future, then I believe we stand a good chance of integrating the often disparate parts of ourselves into a consistent whole, because I think that's what good stories do. Well, thank you for listening to all of this. I am delighted to be a part of you and your life and your thought. And I hope that if you have a comment or if something that you've heard provokes a question, suggestion, or disagreement with you, that you'll let me know. You can always make a comment in the place provided here, or you can email me at frank@thesoulinyou.com. thesoulinyou.com. That's my website. And it's the frank@thesoulinyou.com is a way to get in touch with me. And I always welcome contact. Thanks so much. And I look forward to the next session. See you soon.